My name is David, but that was not always my name. I was born Ahmed Khalil in a small city in Pakistan that I cannot name for safety reasons. When I tell people that my father held a funeral for me while I was still alive, they look confused. How can someone have a funeral when they are still breathing and walking around? But this is exactly what happened when I chose to follow Jesus Christ. Before I share what happened, I want you to know that this story has both sad and happy parts. There were times when I lost people I loved very much, but I also found something more valuable than anything in this world. I hope that as you listen to my story, you will understand why following Jesus was worth everything I had to give up. I grew up in a house that was connected to a large mosque. My father was the Imam, which means he was the religious leader who taught people about Islam and led prayers 5 times every day. My childhood was full of rules about what was halal and what was haram, which means what was allowed and what was forbidden in Islam. My mother wore black clothing that covered her completely whenever she left the house. When I was about 10 years old, I started noticing things that confused me. My father would teach us that Islam was a religion of peace and mercy, but sometimes what I saw did not match what he said. I remember one afternoon when a woman from our neighborhood came to our door crying. Her husband had hit her and given her a black eye because she had talked to a shopkeeper who was a man. She wanted my father to help her and tell her husband to stop hurting her. I stood behind the door and listened as my father talked to her. He told her that she should have been more careful, that she should not talk to men who were not her relatives, and that she needed to obey her husband better. He quoted verses from the Quran about wives submitting to their husbands. Then he sent her back home. I saw the look on her face as she walked away, and something inside me felt wrong about what had just happened. Another time, I heard my father and some other religious men discussing a girl who was caught talking to a boy at school. They were not even holding hands or doing anything bad, just talking. But the religious council wanted to punish her publicly to teach other young people a lesson. I listened as these men planned how many lashes she should receive and where it should happen so everyone could watch. Nobody talked about punishing the boy. They said it was the girl's fault for tempting him and bringing shame to her family. I was only a child, but I remember thinking that something did not seem fair about this. Why was it always the woman's fault? Why did the men make all the decisions? These questions started growing in my mind, but I was too afraid to ask them out loud because questioning Islam was considered a terrible sin. I also noticed how my mother and sisters lived compared to my father and brothers. My mother would cook all day and serve my father and my brothers first, then eat whatever was left over. She had to ask my father's permission to visit her own mother who lived in another part of the city. My older sister was engaged to be married to a cousin she barely knew, and I could hear her crying in her room at night. But in the morning, she would smile and say it was Allah's will and she was happy about it. I loved my family very much, but I started to see that the women in my family were not really free. They lived in a kind of invisible prison where men controlled everything they did. My father was not a bad man compared to some others in our community, but he believed that this was the right way because this was what Islam taught. I was just a boy, but I could see that my mother was sad even though she never complained. These small observations planted seeds of doubt in my heart that would grow bigger as I got older. When I was 12 years old, something happened that would change my entire life. I was a good student and loved to read books, especially stories about adventures and history. One day I was at the market with my older brother who was buying vegetables for our mother. While he was talking to the shopkeeper, I wandered over to a small bookstall nearby. The man selling books had all kinds of things spread out on a cloth on the ground. There were school books, novels, magazines, and religious books. I was looking through them when I noticed a small book with a worn cover pushed to the side. I picked it up and saw that it was written in Urdu, our language. The cover said it was the Injil, which is what Muslims call the Christian Gospels or the New Testament. I knew I should not touch this book. My father had taught us that Christians had corrupted their scriptures and that we should not read them. He said Christians believed wrong things about God and that their book would confuse us. But I was curious. I had never actually seen a Christian book before, and I wanted to know what was inside. The bookseller saw me looking at it and said I could have it for almost nothing because nobody wanted to buy it. I looked around to make sure my brother was not watching, then I quickly paid for it with some coins I had in my pocket. I hid the book inside my shirt and felt my heart beating fast. I felt like I was doing something very wrong, but I could not stop myself. When we got home, I hid the book under my mattress where nobody would find it. That night, after everyone was asleep, I took it out and started reading by the light of a small lamp. Over the next few weeks, I read that small book whenever I could find time alone. I read it in the bathroom, under my blanket at night, and even in the mosque library when I pretended to be studying the Quran. The more I read about Jesus, the more questions filled my mind. Why did Jesus talk about God as a loving Father who cared about every small detail of our lives? In Islam, I learned that Allah was distant and stern, watching to see if we followed the rules correctly. Why did Jesus say that he came to save sinners instead of condemning them? In Islam, we were taught that we had to earn heaven by doing enough good deeds to outweigh our bad deeds. Everything Jesus taught seemed upside down from what I knew. He said the last would be first and the first would be last. He said the poor and humble were blessed. He said that serving others made you great. These ideas were completely new to me, and they made my heart feel something I had never felt before. Around this time, I met a boy at school named Peter who was Christian. There were not many Christians in our area, and most Muslim families did not want their children to be friends with Christian children. But Peter sat next to me in our mathematics class, and we started talking about homework and tests. He was kind and funny, and he never treated me differently even though he knew I was the Imam's son. One day after school, I saw some older boys pushing Peter and calling him bad names because he was Christian. They were about to hit him when I stepped in and told them to stop. I was the Imam's son, so they listened to me and walked away. Peter thanked me, and from that day we became real friends. We would study together and talk about many things, though at first we avoided talking about religion because we both knew it could cause problems. After several months of friendship, I finally got brave enough to ask Peter about his faith. We were sitting in an empty classroom after school, and I asked him what Christians really believed. He seemed surprised but happy that I wanted to know. He told me that Christians believe Jesus is the Son of God who came to earth as a human being to save people from their sins. He explained that Jesus lived a perfect life, then died on a cross to pay the punishment for all the wrong things people have done. He said that 3 days after Jesus died, he came back to life, proving that he was God and that he had power over death. Peter told me that anyone who believes in Jesus and follows him can be forgiven for all their sins and can know for certain that they will go to heaven. He said it was not about following enough rules or doing enough good deeds, but about accepting God's gift of grace. I listened carefully to everything he said, and although it sounded strange to me at first, it also sounded beautiful. Peter could see that I was interested, so he invited me to visit his church one day if I ever wanted to learn more. I told him I would think about it, but inside I was terrified and excited at the same time. For almost a year, I continued reading the Injil in secret and talking with Peter about Jesus. I was torn between two worlds. During the day, I would pray at the mosque with my father and memorize Quran verses like a good Muslim boy. But at night, I would read about Jesus and pray in a new way, talking to God like he was someone who actually wanted to hear from me. Peter gave me more Christian books that I hid carefully, and he answered my endless questions with patience. The more I learned, the more I realized that I had to make a choice. I could not keep living this double life forever. Either Islam was true or Christianity was true, but they could not both be true because they taught completely different things about God, about Jesus, and about how to be saved. The weight of this decision pressed down on me every day. One Friday evening when I was 13 years old, I finally made my choice. My family had gone to a wedding celebration and I was home alone because I told them I was feeling sick. I went to my room, locked the door, and knelt down beside my bed. I took out the Injil that I had been hiding for over a year and held it in my hands. I prayed, but not the ritual Islamic prayers I had said thousands of times. Instead, I just talked honestly to God. I told him that I was confused and scared. I told him that I did not know what was true anymore. I told him that if Jesus was really who he claimed to be, then I wanted to know him. I told him that I was willing to follow Jesus even if it cost me everything. Then I said words that changed my life forever. I told God that I believed Jesus died for my sins and rose from the dead, and that I wanted Jesus to be my Savior and Lord. Nothing dramatic happened in that moment. There was no voice from heaven or bright light. But I felt something change deep inside me. It was like a heavy weight that I had been carrying my whole life suddenly lifted off my shoulders. I felt peace and freedom that I had never experienced before. I also felt fear because I knew what this decision would mean for my future. I told Peter what had happened, and he was overjoyed. He took me to meet his pastor, a kind old man who explained more about what it meant to follow Jesus. The pastor warned me that my family would not understand and that I would face serious trouble when they found out. He offered to help me in any way he could, but he also told me that following Jesus sometimes requires great sacrifice. I understood this, but I did not fully realize just how great the sacrifice would be. For several months, I lived in fear, going through the motions of being a Muslim while secretly being a Christian in my heart. I started meeting with a small group of other believers in Peter's home, where we would read the Bible and pray together. The truth came out on a hot afternoon when I was 14 years old. I had been careless and left my Injil under my pillow instead of hiding it properly in its usual spot. My mother came into my room to put away clean clothes and found it. She stood there holding the book, her face turning pale. She asked me quietly why I had this book and where I got it. I could have lied. I could have said a Christian boy gave it to me and I was just curious about it. But something inside me could not lie anymore. I was tired of hiding and pretending. So I looked at my mother and told her the truth. I told her that I had been reading it for 2 years. I told her that I believed what it said. I told her that I had decided to follow Jesus. My mother dropped the book like it had burned her hand. She started crying and asking me what I had done. She begged me to say I was joking, that this was not real. But I could not take back my words. Within an hour, my father came home. My mother had sent my brother to fetch him from the mosque, telling him it was an emergency. When my father walked into the house and saw my mother crying and the Injil on the table, his face became hard like stone. He asked me to explain myself. I repeated what I had told my mother. I said that I believed Jesus was the Son of God and that I wanted to follow him. My father's reaction was worse than I had imagined. He started shouting, asking me if I understood what I was saying. He told me I was committing apostasy, which in Islam is one of the worst sins possible. He said I was bringing shame on our entire family, destroying his reputation, and throwing away my salvation. He grabbed my shoulders and shook me, demanding that I take back my words and repent. He said if I refused, there would be terrible consequences. But even though I was shaking with fear, I could not deny Jesus. Something inside me was stronger than my fear. I told my father quietly that I was sorry for hurting him, but I could not pretend to be Muslim anymore. What happened next was like a nightmare. My father called a meeting with other religious leaders from our mosque and community. They came to our house and questioned me for hours. They asked me what I believed and why. They quoted verses from the Quran trying to prove I was wrong. They warned me about hellfire and eternal punishment. They told me I was deceived by Satan and that Christians had corrupted my mind. Some of them were angry and threatening. Others pretended to be kind and reasonable, trying to convince me to change my mind. But no matter what they said, I could not deny what I knew in my heart was true. Finally, after hours of this, my father made an announcement that broke my heart. He said that if I would not renounce Christianity and return to Islam, then I was no longer his son. He said I had died to the family and would be treated as if I was dead. He told me I had 3 days to change my mind, or I would be cast out completely. I looked at my mother who was weeping silently. I looked at my brothers and sisters who would not meet my eyes. and I realized that I was about to lose everything I had ever known. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. My father would not speak to me or look at me. My mother brought food to my room but cried the whole time. My siblings avoided me like I had a disease. I spent most of the time praying and reading my Bible, asking God for strength and wisdom. Peter and his pastor came secretly to encourage me, bringing me water and bread because I could barely eat what my family gave me. They offered to help me escape, to hide me somewhere safe. But I kept hoping that maybe my family would change their minds, that maybe they would see I was still the same person, just with a different faith. On the 3rd day, my father came to my room and asked me one final time if I would reject Christianity and return to Islam. I looked at him with tears running down my face and told him I could not. I told him I loved him and my family, but I could not deny Jesus. He nodded slowly, and I saw something in his eyes that looked like grief mixed with anger. The next morning, my father gathered the whole community at the mosque for a special announcement. I was forced to stand in front of everyone while he declared that his son Ahmed had committed apostasy and was dead to the family. After the announcement, my father's friends took me back to our house where my mother had packed my few belongings into a small bag. She hugged me one last time, sobbing into my shoulder, then pushed me away and ran into another room. I never saw her face again. That afternoon, they held a real funeral for me even though I was standing right there watching. They wrapped an empty shroud and carried it to the cemetery while reciting funeral prayers. They dug a grave and put a marker with my name on it and the date of my supposed death. Ahmed Khalil, son of Imam Abdullah, was declared dead at 14 years old. I watched from a distance as my father and brothers threw dirt on the empty grave. I watched as people offered condolences to my family for losing their son. I watched as they buried the person I used to be. Then Peter's father came and took me away to their home, where I would live from that day forward. As we drove away from the cemetery, I turned back one last time and saw my father standing at my grave with his hand on the stone marker. Even from far away, I could see his shoulders shaking. He was crying, and that image is burned into my memory forever. I had not died, but to my family, I was as dead as if they had buried my actual body in that ground. The first months living with Peter's family were incredibly hard. I felt like I was drowning in grief. I missed my mother's cooking, my siblings' voices, even my father's strict rules. Everything familiar was gone. Peter's pastor helped me understand more about my new faith and what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. He taught me that being a Christian was not just about believing certain things, but about having a relationship with God through Jesus. Meeting them and hearing how God had been faithful to them gave me hope that God would be faithful to me too. After about 6 months, I made the decision to be baptized. This was a big step because baptism is the public declaration that you belong to Jesus. In Islam, no one gets baptized, so this would be a clear sign that I had truly left my old faith. The baptism took place at Peter's church on a Sunday morning. There were maybe 50 people there, and they all knew my story. When I went down into the water and the pastor baptized me in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I felt like I was being washed clean of all my past. When I came up out of the water, everyone cheered and hugged me. Peter's mother was crying happy tears. At that moment, I realized something important. I had lost one family, but God had given me a new family. These people who were not related to me by blood loved me and accepted me. They were my brothers and sisters in Christ, and that bond was even stronger than biological family because it was eternal. I also chose a new name that day. The pastor asked me what I wanted to be called, and I chose David. I chose this name because David in the Bible was someone who loved God with his whole heart despite his mistakes. I wanted to be like that David, someone who followed God no matter what it cost. As the years passed, I grew stronger in my faith and began to understand why God allowed me to go through such difficult times. When I was 16, Peter's pastor asked me if I would be willing to share my testimony with the church youth group. At first, I was terrified to speak in front of people, but I agreed to try. After that first time sharing my testimony, Other churches began inviting me to speak. Word spread about the Imam's son who had become a Christian and been declared dead by his family. I also started meeting other young people who were secretly questioning Islam, who had found Christian materials, who were curious about Jesus but terrified of the consequences. I would meet with them privately and answer their questions, sharing what I had learned. Some of them eventually decided to follow Jesus, and I had the privilege of walking with them through their own difficult journeys. Now I am 20 years old, and 6 years have passed since my family held that funeral for me. I still think about them every single day. Through a cousin who secretly stayed in contact with me, I learned that my mother's health has not been good and that she still cries often. As I finish sharing my story with you, I want to speak directly to your heart about what really matters in life. Whether you are young or old, whether you come from a Christian family or another religion, whether your life has been easy or difficult, there is one truth that stands above everything else. Jesus Christ is real. He loves you more than you can imagine, and knowing Him is worth any price you might have to pay. I am not saying this because someone told me to say it or because I read it in a book. I am saying this because I have experienced it personally. I gave up my family, my name, my home, and my future as I knew it. He gave me a family that will last forever. Most importantly, He gave me Himself, and that is the greatest treasure anyone could ever have. I also want to say something important about people who come from different religions, especially Islam. Please do not hate them or fear them or treat them as enemies. Remember that I was once Muslim, and if Christians had treated me with hatred, I might never have been willing to listen to the gospel. My name is David. I was declared dead at 14 years old, but I have never been more alive. Jesus made that possible, and He can do the same for you. I want to invite you to share your prayer requests in the comments below. Whatever you're facing today, whether it's a personal challenge, a family situation, a health concern, or simply a desire for spiritual growth, our intercessory team is here to stand with you in prayer. We believe in the power of collective prayer, and we don't want you to carry your burdens alone. Take a moment to write out your request, and know that it will be lifted up with faith and compassion by our prayer warriors who are committed to interceding on your behalf.